Getting on to season 2, where Walter will be tested and go through great change, drastically increasing his negative influence on the world around him. Vince Gilligan says that Walter goes from beige to green, showing he's going from lifeless to lively. Beige in season 1 to green in season 2. His desire and inspiration to reach out for his goals only getting stronger as time goes on, showing his power is growing as well. However, this season also humbles Walter in a lot of ways, which I'll be getting into. In the first episode, when Walter is paranoid of Tuco following him, he spots a suspicious car that seems to be watching him. This car wasn't exactly trying to hide, but one could argue that Walt's perception here is still good. But Vince Gilligan himself confirmed this person in the car was in fact not Tuco, it was just Paranoia. So while this could be some weak evidence that Walter could spot if someone is following or tailing him, it's not much. Maybe one could argue Walt was nerfed here because of the stress and or even trauma of seeing Tuco's goon get beat to death. The articles on screen do show that there's truth to the idea that Walter was nerfed here and probably other times in his journey. The trauma getting in the way of his thinking ability. Meaning if he wasn't nerfed, he would have been able to detect that the person in the car wasn't Tuco, and who knows what other situations Walter could have performed better had his mind been in tip-top shape. Anyway, moving on to the poison known as ricin. This is something Walter tries to use multiple times throughout the series, but doesn't successfully get off until the final episode of the show. It's shown to kill Lydia in a matter of days, getting her bedridden in only a matter of hours. Walter is able to convert this from beans into a powder of some sort. However, the thing about ricin is that you can also turn into other things, such as mist, suggesting he could fill up a room with the stuff probably and get people to inhale it. We see him mix it in with some food, but he can also of course mix it in with liquids, like Jesse attempted to do with coffee. On top of it being extremely difficult to test for, even if they do confirm you've been poisoned with it, there's no cure. Also, the symptoms themselves depend on whether the ricin was breathed in, swallowed, or injected, making it even more tedious to counter. This poison was experimented by even the US government. Though they found it would be really hard to use ricin on a large scale and kill many people at once, they also concluded it could be really effective when thinking smaller, which is exactly what Walter does. As he explained to Jesse, ricin was used on a Bulgarian writer who apparently the Soviet Union did not like. So they got their secret police and decided to put ricin on the pointy end of an umbrella and then poke this writer with it, which was enough to kill him. The exact way they put the poison on the umbrella was complex and required a group of smart people to pull off. So while Walter didn't do anything this complex, he was just a single dude as opposed to a government-funded group of people. Regardless, Walter was almost successful at poisoning Tuco, but couldn't account for Hector suddenly showing signs of being lucid. After dealing with Tuco, Hank showed up and this forced Walt and Jesse to run. What's interesting about this scene though is that when the duo leave on foot through the desert, the police didn't check the area and find footprints in the sand and dirt that would indicate people were in the area. They had good reason to check around the area as well, since someone had to be responsible for Tuco getting shot in the gut and bleeding from the head. It's probably another example of Walter and Jesse being lucky and the cops just didn't check. Otherwise, I don't see why any detective wouldn't just follow the trail of footprints. Ignoring that detail though, Walter still had a huge problem, with himself being missing for multiple days and then Jesse's car staying at the crime scene of Tuco's death. It was extremely likely most people on the planet would get caught by the police or at least be put on their suspect list. But Walter's intelligence managed to dig himself out of this hole. He used a fugue state idea to explain where he's been this whole time and at the same time thought of something for Jesse, which was simply to make it look like he was at a motel all weekend, going as far as to tell Jesse to get a woman to support the lie and be a witness. Jesse could never explain why his own car was there, and it most likely is impossible to do anything about that. All Jesse can do is just play ignorant and hope the cops simply conclude Tuco stole his car. Walter even then thought about the meth lab in Jesse's basement, reminding him to go clean it up before the police could find it. Jesse was arguably lucky the cops didn't just break into the house and go fetch him immediately. So anyway, Walter thought of all this in the desert while most likely dehydrated and mega tired. Also, by the way, if Hank or the DEA ever found the pistol that Jesse had, they could have traced the bullet in Tuco's gut to the gun. Thus, jail time for Walter and Jesse. However, Walter thought of this and hid the pistol, tying up yet another loose end. This situation, as I laid out, was very troublesome, but yet Walter managed to come out on top. With the only real problem is Jesse losing his money and then Walter's family losing some respect for him, embarrassing them thanks to the fugue state plan. During the episode Breakage, Walter wants to become like Tuco, telling Jesse to be more bossy and aggressive with his dealers. This is the first time we start to really see how Walter has this weird power where he absorbs aspects of the villains that he kills. So for Tuco, Walt tries to enact his ruthlessness, his serious tough guy attitude where if someone tries to mess with them, they need to be punished hard. As for Crazy 8, it's a bit more subtle, but he ends up making a sandwich that is exactly how Crazy 8 liked his sandwiches. That's in a later season, and so are the other examples of his absorption trait, but I'll get to those another time. So this new Tuco aspect in Walter tells Jesse to handle the situation with the junkies stealing their product and money. But it's thanks to this that Jesse goes to their house and becomes traumatized from the whole event, which made Jesse go into a depressive slump where he didn't want to leave his home. Usually Tuco would beat up an employee like this, but this is where Walter becomes better than Tuco, where he tries to manipulate Jesse into feeling better and continuing their business. Not that Walter didn't care at all, but that business would slow down if Jesse didn't go outside, so he had to put a stop to that. So my point is that Walter mixes his manipulation with Tuco's ruthlessness to successfully get his way. Keep this moment in mind because this is going to be very important later in season 4. Then moving on to the episode where Saul Goodman is introduced, Walt once again does another motivational speech, but this time to Hank, getting Hank out of his slump and inspiring him to continue facing the harsh world. So besides the time he straight up lies, Walter really does have a talent for galvanizing people. But getting to the Badger situation, Walter had a great idea to distract Hank while Jesse went out to warn Badger that he was on the wrong bench. This is proof of good improv on Walter's part, along with some good acting skill to go along with it. This is mere speculation on my part, but you could say that the random bald dude that Badger mistook for Jimmy In-N-Out could have been sent by fate or the god of luck themselves to test Walter and see what he could do in this situation. I only say this because it's extremely bad luck in the first place for a bald dude to come sit near Badger at the exact moment where that would be a problem. Overall, this episode doesn't help Walter's case in terms of looking like a drug lord mastermind. The narrative seems to point that Walter overall doesn't know what he's doing and is going to get caught sooner or later. Absorbing Tuco's ruthlessness is not enough, and the god of luck in this universe needs to intervene by sending in Saul Goodman, someone similar to Walter in terms of creating chaos. Season 1 was just breaking Walter into the business. Season 2 is all about destroying Walter's innocence and destroying his previous self to respawn and rise as a phoenix, just like episode 12's title implies. His evolution at this point is to prepare him for season 3 where he'll be tangling with forces much higher than Tuco. So the point is that Walter is not ready for higher level antagonism and is just barely escaping the DEA. So Walter is definitely not a mastermind, and without the god of luck, there's good reason to think Walter wouldn't even make it to season 3. That being said, just like with the situation with Badger talking to the wrong dude, fate didn't want to make things too easy for Walt. Just because Saul is there to help doesn't mean that this journey won't have trials and tests to see if Walter has the mastermind in him. Which I think he does, but the mastermind in him is still developing and will reach its potential later. But fate didn't want to see it snuffed out just yet. So my point is that while Walter is definitely not a mastermind now, it doesn't mean he'll never be one later. Even Gus Fring, who even Mike and Lydia held great respect for, had help from Peter Schuler in Santiago, Chile. That duo, just like Walter and Jesse, were in a vague but highly dangerous situation, but worked together to make it out alive. I doubt Gus was equally as competent back then compared to his prime self where he's on the ball. So my point is that the same could be said for Walter, where he needs help from Jesse and Saul in order to reach his full potential, just like how Gus needed help as well. Moving on, in the episode 4 Days Out, Walter makes up another good lie about going to his parents, while in reality he was cooking with Jesse for multiple days. This lie is bad in the sense that obviously at some point Skyler is gonna find out from Walt's parents that he didn't see them, but keep in mind that Walter thought he was gonna die very soon. So he didn't plan for or care about the future since he wouldn't be around by the time Skyler found out anyway. Also another lie is when he told Jesse that the methylamine was gonna spoil, which is something that he thought of on the spot. Then one of the more science-related feats is when he managed to jumpstart the RV battery with a bunch of sponges, powder, and metal parts. Also, since he took the powdered carbon from the brake pads, that means Walter or Jesse had to drive without brakes on the RV, which would be impressive. In the episode Over, Walter tries to fix a water heater, but Bryan Cranston implies Walter isn't very good at that. Also, this is kind of random, but when Walter is standing next to Bob, it reminds me of when Hank Hill also found his clone when shopping for parts as well. I just found it kind of funny. Later on, Walter takes a quick glance at a shopping cart and immediately knows someone is about to make meth, further showing that his perception is excellent. In the same scene, he also finds yet another clone of himself, along with Jesse's clone. Why the episode is trying to show parallels of Walter, I'm not sure. Maybe fate is trying to test whether or not Walter would become a normal guy like Bob or continue to be a drug maker like the bald dude outside. Showing Walter could escape this business at least after getting the money from Gus Fring, but this encounter with the clone foreshadows how Walter is gonna definitely stay in the business because he's bored and cleaning this water heater is not doing it for him. In the episode Mandala, we see the first example of Walter and Jesse being in over their heads via the death of Combo, having gotten killed by Gus's men. Saul further emphasizes how Walt and Jesse suck at peddling drugs, that it's not for them. Even later in season 5, they needed Mike's help and then Declan's help to sell the meth, using drug mules. So the art of drug dealing personally is not something Walter and Jesse improve on really. In this episode, Walter also hides his phone in the ceiling of his classroom, which I think is a bit silly. I'm not sure why he couldn't keep it in his pocket or in his desk. Maybe he was paranoid that the police would suddenly show up and search him. I'm not sure what he was thinking. Then getting on to when he met Gus Fring, Walt managed to figure out Gus was the mysterious guy he was looking for by merely looking at the window and seeing Gus's face, noticing the look Gus was giving him, as if he didn't want him there or knew who Walter was. Either way, Walter is able to then convince Gus Fring to work with him and change his mind. While his manipulation is fine, it's mostly the leverage his meth gives him that carries him in this situation. Similar to the future conversation he'll have with Declan in the future, where, again, Walter uses the purity of his meth to get what he wants. Gus is a smart and wise guy, obviously, and to change his mind is still impressive. It could be that he wants to rush his plan to get an edge over the cartel with superior products, but it's just speculation. Whether or not Gale vouched for Walter at this exact point is unknown. It could have been before or after, so it's hard to say if there was external help for Walter here. But nonetheless, Walter used his silver tongue to get his way and was successful. In the episode Phoenix, we see one of Walter's clever hiding places when he shows his money to Holly. He then comes across a situation where he's not sure how to give the money to his family, but Saul comes in and gives him a solution, bailing Walter out of needing to think for himself. Honestly, Walter Jr. deciding to just now make the donation page after all this time is fate again giving Walter another hand, providing the perfect way to get money to his family. Narratively speaking, this is for the audience to see more of Walter's pride and show off more of his true character, someone that hates charity. So maybe one could argue that fate is trying to figure out how Walter reacts to this, seeing if Walter will sabotage his good fortune or not. But speaking of fate, this is where things get wild. Later on in the same episode, the God of Luck pulls lots of strings this time to actually make it so Walter just so happens to run into Jane's dad at a bar. Even Walter in season 3 mentions how impossibly unlikely this meeting was, and yet it happens. However, my main point here is how this meeting helped Walter. If this conversation with Jane's dad never happened, Walter would have never went back to Jesse's place and then accidentally killed Jane, thus saving Jesse's life, and thus Walter got to keep his tool. Again, you could argue fate set this up as a test to see what Walter would do, save Jane or let her die. Then in the finale of season 2, we have Mike who comes in and cleans up the whole Jane situation for Jesse, again showing how Saul and his connections were essential. Without Saul, who knows what they would have done in this situation. I can see Walter suggesting that he melts Jane's body, but Jesse would probably not like that, and it could spark drama, blah blah blah. In a later scene, Walter's emotional intelligence is kind of lacking here because he somehow doesn't notice Skyler is leaving social cues that indicate she's mad at Walter and is planning to leave him. Sure, he doesn't know how he screwed up with asking about the second cell phone since he was drugged, but Walter could have at least guessed that his parents told Skyler that he never visited. He just hoped and assumed that Skyler and his parents would never talk again for some reason. If he was really on the ball, he would have called his parents and convinced them to lie for him or something, somehow. It's hard to say if Walter made an error with the second cell phone situation from earlier in the season, where the call from Jesse alerted Skyler's suspicion while she was in the tub. At worst, Walter should have never brought the phone in the bathroom with Skyler. He should have thought of the possibility of Jesse calling in front of Skyler. That being said, he was nerfed due to being recently traumatized. Also, Skyler catching on here and fully catching on at the end of the season is not an anti-feat for Walter because Vince regards Skyler as a smart woman and found it unrealistic for Skyler to stay in the dark any longer. Skyler is an accountant and managed to think of the genius gambling storyline. She is not dumb at all, and it was impressive for Walt to trick her as long as he did. Also, another smart thing Skyler did was managing to get the laundromat from that dude with the eyebrows, which was pretty genius. Vince Gilligan says on the Breaking Bad Insider podcast that Walt turns into a world-class liar, as early as season 2.
I mean, Walt is a hell of a liar, and you'll see this season coming up. He's turns into a world-class liar.
Even in behind-the-scenes footage for this episode, Vince says Walter is turning into the world's best liar.
He's turning into the world's greatest liar by this point. but she doesn't buy it.
For anyone that asks, how did Skyler catch on then? All it means is that Skyler is just that smart, that she would be able to see through a world-class liar. Even in the behind-the-scenes video for the episode Down, Vince says that Skyler is not a fool, and again expresses how she's not stupid.
There's a good bit of agility, we think anyway, to the story we're telling there, because we allow Skyler to be a smart character. She's nobody's fool.
However, Walter is nerfed by the fact Skyler is his wife, and she knows him better than anyone, knows his mannerisms and such. And thus, it's just personally harder for Walter to lie to her specifically. So it's a mix of Skyler actually being a smart and cunning woman, and she knows Walter really well. So this idea of Walter being a bad liar is just false. It's not supported by the narrative or the author himself at all. So anyone that thinks Walter is a bad liar, they're just in denial. My last point for this season is me addressing the eyeball. For anyone paying attention, obviously what I'm going to say is that the eyeball represents fate or the god of luck. Vince himself says it's probably the eye of God, but that's his personal interpretation. The wording and tone of the quote puts it like it's up to everyone's interpretation. Anyway, why did fate drop the teddy bear and the eyeball in the pool? I say it's fate telling Walter to look at the consequences of his actions. While fate had a hand to play in the sequence of events, it was Walter's choice to go to Jesse's house and then let Jane die, which led to Jane's father's mental breakdown. Now the plane crash is his fault. Why is fate telling Walt this? I guess to warn him that chaos and destruction will never end if Walter continues on this road. That fate will help him not get caught by the cops or get killed, but to continue being a criminal is completely up to Walter, and thus he is responsible for everything. That's why in the beginning of season 3 that Walter will feel extremely guilty for everything. Fate is not only warning him that death will come, but fate also wants to see his reaction and figure out if Walter can handle the guilt, if he's cut out for this business. But anyway, even if you totally dismiss this divine intervention idea, it doesn't change the fact that Walter White has a special talent for causing death and destruction to everyone around him, especially indirectly like with the plane crash. Not many other characters in this series has a similar ability to cause dominoes to fall and thus cause death and destruction. That to face off against Walter, you would have to overcome this special talent, which nobody in the series can do. Anyway, I'll see you in part 3. Bye bye.